This isn't some legal thriller I dreamed up. This is a true story from my life. It's the account of what I had to do when the system I believed in failed the only person I had left. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the Mills House Hotel dripped light onto the sea of black tie suits and sequin gowns, a glittering affair for the Charleston Bar Association. I stood near the back, a ghost in a borrowed tuxedo, holding a glass of lukewarm water I had no intention of drinking. They were all here to celebrate Judge Alistair Monroe, to present him with a gold-plated gavel for his lifetime of distinguished service. From my vantage point, he was a silhouette on a brightly lit stage, his voice booming through the speakers, a rich, syrupy baritone that oozed confidence and authority. He was accepting his award, and he just launched into an anecdote about the moral weight of the bench when I heard my own words, my own grief, spill from his lips. A father once wrote to me, Monroe began, his tone pious, and in his letter, he spoke of the tangled threads of justice, how sometimes the law cannot mend what is broken, but must instead preserve the integrity of the tapestry for the good of all. He paused for dramatic effect as the room hung on his every word. My blood went cold. He was talking about me. He was quoting, almost verbatim, from the desperate, soul-bearing letter I had sent him a year ago, after his verdict had destroyed my daughter, Clara. But he was twisting it, weaponizing my pain, using the raw words of a grieving father as a shield for his own corruption, a poetic justification for the very injustice that had put her in the ground. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My story, the real one, doesn't begin in a ballroom. It begins in a quiet, sun-drenched workshop in a carriage house south of Broad Street, surrounded by the sweet, earthy smell of indigo and madder root. That was Clara's world. At 34, she was a supernova of creativity and determination. After a decade working for big, soul-crushing textile giants in New York, she had come home to Charleston to build something of her own. She called it Oaken Weave. Her idea was both revolutionary and ancient, creating vibrant, luxury fabrics using sustainable, historically accurate dyeing techniques native to the Lowcountry. She spent years researching, perfecting her methods, and eventually patented a process for creating a color-fast Carolina gold from goldenrod that was simply breathtaking. It was her life's work, poured into swaths of linen and silk. I was a retired history professor, a widower for 5 years, and she was my entire world. I'd watch her work, her hands stained with color, her face lit with a passion that seemed to generate its own light. Her business was small, but it was growing. She'd just landed a small contract with a boutique hotel in Savannah, and for the first time, she was turning a real profit. The trouble started, as it so often does, with a man who saw what she had built and decided it was easier to take than to create. Harrison Croft owned one of the largest textile manufacturing companies on the East Coast, a soulless corporate behemoth. He was a third-generation Charleston blue blood, a man who moved through the city like he owned the cobblestones. Croft tried to buy Clara out. He offered her a pittance, a sum that was an insult to her years of labor. He wanted her patent, her soul. She politely, but firmly, refused. A month later, Croft's company launched a new line of artisanal fabrics. The centerpiece was a stunning goldenrod yellow, marketed with a folksy, disingenuous story about rediscovering lost traditions. It was her color. Her process. He had stolen it, flagrantly and without shame. We found out later he'd poached one of her former interns, a young man desperate for a foothold in the industry, who handed over her process notes for a signing bonus. Clara was devastated, but she wasn't broken. "This is why the patent system exists, Dad," she told me, her jaw set with a familiar stubbornness. "He can't do this. The law will protect me." We hired the best intellectual property lawyer we could afford and filed an injunction. The case, by the cruel lottery of the docket, was assigned to the court of Judge Alistair Monroe. I knew of him, of course. In Charleston, you couldn't not know him. He was a fixture in the society pages, a lion of the legal community. He cultivated an image of an old-world intellectual, a man of profound wisdom and unshakable integrity. He had a reputation for being tough, but fair. We believed in that reputation. We clung to it. The trial was a farce. Our lawyer presented a mountain of evidence, lab reports showing the chemical markers in Croft's fabrics were identical to Clara's proprietary formula, dated journal entries from her, sworn testimony from the supplier who sold her the unique mordant she used. It was an open and shut case. But Croft's legal team, a phalanx of high-priced sharks from a firm on King Street, didn't attack the evidence. They attacked Clara. They painted her as a bitter, inexperienced amateur, a hobbyist who was lashing out at a successful businessman. And Judge Monroe let them. He sustained their objections, overruled ours, and treated Clara's testimony with a thinly veiled contempt. He looked at my brilliant, hard-working daughter as if she were a child throwing a tantrum. The one moment I look back on and see the rot beneath the floorboards, came during the closing arguments. Croft himself was on the stand, radiating a smug, unearned confidence. Monroe leaned forward, a benevolent smile on his face, and asked a question unrelated to anything. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, "I see you're on the board of the Spoleto Festival this year. Commendable. So important to preserve the cultural heritage of our city." It was a signal. A public affirmation of shared status. A quiet declaration of allegiance. Croft was part of the club. We were not. Monroe's verdict came a week later. He ruled against Clara, dissolving the injunction and ordering her to pay Croft's legal fees, a sum that would completely bankrupt her. The ruling was a masterpiece of legal sophistry. He wrote that while there were superficial similarities in the dyeing processes, our side had failed to prove malicious intent. He called Croft an innovator and Clara's patent overly broad. He destroyed her. Not just her business, but her spirit. The light in her eyes, that fierce, brilliant light, went out. She had believed in the rules, and fairness, and she had learned that the rules were a lie. Oaken Weave folded. The debt was immense. Clara took a job doing inventory in a warehouse to make ends meet. She grew quiet, withdrawn. The stress gnawed at her. A year after the verdict, she had a massive heart attack. The doctors called it Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Broken heart syndrome. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but I knew the truth. Judge Alistair Monroe had signed her death certificate the day he handed down his verdict. After the funeral, a suffocating silence fell over my house. In that silence, I found the letter. It was a copy of the one I had sent to Judge Monroe a few weeks after the trial, a desperate, final plea. I hadn't told Clara about it. I didn't want to give her false hope. I had poured my heart out, not as a legal argument, but as a father. I wrote about justice, not as an abstract concept, but as a real, tangible thing that protects the creative and the vulnerable from the powerful and the predatory. I wrote about my daughter's spirit. It was in that letter that I had used the phrase, the tangled threads of justice. Standing there in that opulent ballroom, listening to that monster twist my agony into a self-congratulatory anecdote, something inside me broke. It was a quiet, clean snap. The grief that had been a fog for a year suddenly crystallized into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. He had taken her life, and now he was taking our story, our pain, and wearing it like a medal. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just a sad old man, a footnote in his triumphant career. He was wrong. A historian knows that empires always look their strongest right before they fall. And I would dedicate every second I had left on this earth to finding the cracks in his foundation. I didn't know how I was going to do it. But as I watched him accept the thunderous applause, smiling his benevolent, corrupt smile, I made a silent vow to my daughter. He wouldn't just be exposed. He would be ruined. And I would be the one to do it, using the only tool I had left, time. He had no idea he had just been placed under the microscope of a man who'd spent his life studying the downfall of tyrants. His war was over, mine was just beginning. The weeks following the grotesque gala at the Mills house were a study in methodical quiet. I became a creature of archives and databases, my world shrinking to the hushed halls of the Charleston County Public Library and the glowing screen of my decade-old desktop computer. Grief is an energy, I learned. Left untended, it consumes you. But channeled, focused, it can become a powerful engine. Mine was powering a single, cold-minded investigation. I wasn't a lawyer or a detective, I was a historian. And a historian's trade is finding the patterns the powerful try to erase. I began with Judge Monroe's verdicts, going back 15 years. I spent my days poring over public records, my fingers dusty from old case files, my eyes strained from hours of reading microfiche. At first, it was a blur of legal jargon, a wall of text designed to be impenetrable. But slowly, a faint outline began to emerge from the noise. I wasn't looking for overtly criminal rulings. Monroe was too smart for that. His corruption would be subtle, buried in the discretionary calls a judge makes every day: admissibility of evidence, scheduling delays, jury instructions. I started a spreadsheet. It was a simple thing, with columns for case numbers, plaintiffs, defendants, their legal representation, and the final verdict. I worked backward from Clara's case. Her opponent, Harrison Croft, was represented by a prestigious firm, Rutledge, Pinckney and Crane. I flagged the name. Then I started searching for other cases Monroe had presided over that involved that same firm. It was tedious, painstaking work. Days bled into one another. The young librarian started to recognize me, the old man in the corner with his stacks of files and quiet intensity. They'd leave a cup of water on my table without me having to ask. It was in my third week that I found the first clear thread. A zoning dispute. A small, family-owned restaurant on East Bay Street was fighting a development company that wanted to build a high-rise hotel that would block their historic view of the harbor. The restaurant had a rock-solid case based on city preservation ordinances. Their opponent, a faceless LLC called Palmetto Holdings, was represented by Rutledge, Pinckney, and Crane. Judge Monroe had presided. The verdict was a shocker. Monroe had ruled in favor of the developer, citing a new, obscure interpretation of an air rights statute. The restaurant was ruined. The hotel was built. I added it to my spreadsheet. Then I found another. A medical malpractice suit against a prominent Charleston surgeon. The evidence of negligence was damning. The patient's family was poised to win a significant settlement. The surgeon's counsel? Rutledge, Pinckney, and Crane. The judge? Alistair Monroe. Just before the trial was set to begin, Monroe ruled a key piece of evidence, a sworn deposition from a nurse who witnessed the negligence, as inadmissible on a technicality. The family's case collapsed. They settled for a fraction of what they deserved. The pattern was becoming clearer. It wasn't just the law firm. It was the type of client they represented, powerful, wealthy, and deeply embedded in the local establishment. These were Harrison Croft's people, the surgeon's people, the developer's people. And in Judge Monroe's courtroom, they never lost. But this was just correlation, not causation. It was smoke, but I needed to find the fire. A corrupt judge wouldn't take a bag of cash. It would be cleaner, more sophisticated. It would be hidden in plain sight. I shifted my research from the courthouse to the county's register of deeds. If money was moving, it had to be moving through assets. Property, businesses, trusts. I started with Monroe himself. His financial disclosures were public record, but they were carefully sanitized. He owned his home, a beautiful historic house south of Broad, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, and a small beach house on Sullivan's Island. No red flags. Then I searched for his wife, Eleanor Monroe. And that's when I found it. It wasn't a smoking gun, but a tiny, almost invisible tripwire. 10 years ago, Eleanor Monroe had founded a consulting company. A simple LLC named EM Consulting. Its stated purpose was vague, providing historical and architectural advisory services for real estate development. It was the perfect cover for a history professor's wife. It sounded plausible, respectable. Almost no one would look twice. I started cross-referencing the dates of her company's transactions with the dates of her husband's suspicious verdicts. The public records for an LLC aren't detailed, but you can see major asset transfers. For weeks, I found nothing. Just small, regular consulting fees from legitimate historical preservation societies. Monroe was careful. My breakthrough came not from a government database, but from an old, forgotten society blog. I was searching for information on Palmetto Holdings, the developer that had crushed the little restaurant. I found a post from 6 years ago about the groundbreaking ceremony for their new hotel. It was a gallery of grainy photos. And in one of them, standing next to the head of the development company, was Harrison Croft, the man who stole my daughter's patent. They were smiling, shaking hands. The caption identified them as project partners. My heart hammered in my chest. They were connected. I dug deeper into Palmetto Holdings. It was a shell company, its ownership hidden behind layers of other LLCs. But with enough digging, I finally traced its parent company back to a real estate investment trust managed by a man named Julian Croft, Harrison Croft's brother. The pieces were locking into place. I went back to the Register of Deeds, my hands trembling slightly as I typed. I wasn't searching for EM Consulting anymore. I was searching for land deals involving Palmetto Holdings around the time of the zoning verdict. And there it was. 1 week, 7 days, after Monroe handed down the verdict that allowed the hotel to be built, a land transaction was recorded. A small, seemingly worthless parcel of undeveloped marshland in a remote part of Charleston County was sold. The seller was a family trust, with the sole trustee being Eleanor Monroe. The buyer was a subsidiary of Palmetto Holdings. The price was $350,000. $350,000 for 5 acres of unusable swamp. It was the bribe. It wasn't a briefcase full of cash. It was a land deal, washed clean through a real estate transaction. The money hadn't gone directly to the judge. It had gone to his wife's trust, laundered through an absurdly overvalued land purchase by the very people who had benefited from his ruling. This was his method. This was the blueprint of his corruption. I felt a cold, vindictive certainty settle over me. I now knew how he did it. The next step was to prove it. I printed out the land transfer record, the verdict date, the photo of Croft and the developer. I laid them out on the library table, a constellation of corruption. The librarian walked by and gave me a sympathetic smile. "Making progress, Mr. Finch?" she asked softly. "I believe I am," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I believe I'm finally beginning to understand the history." The road ahead was still impossibly long. I had a blueprint, but Monroe was a fortress, surrounded by walls of money, power, and influence. How could one old man, armed with nothing but a library card and a burning sense of purpose, ever hope to breach those walls? He would crush me, bury me in legal fees and threats until I was nothing but dust. The thought was terrifying, but as I packed up my papers, another thought eclipsed it. He had already taken everything that mattered. What more did I have to lose? Knowing how a crime is committed and proving it in a way that matters are two vastly different things. I had the skeleton of Judge Monroe's scheme, but it was just that, a skeleton. To the outside world, it was circumstantial. A series of coincidences. A shrewd land deal by his wife. A string of legal victories for a successful law firm. Anyone I brought this to would dismiss it, and me, as the ramblings of a grief-stricken old man. Monroe was a king in his city, and kings are not deposed by whispers. I learned this the hard way. My first move was naive. I compiled my research into a neat, 20-page dossier, complete with timelines, copies of the land deeds, and case summaries. I made an appointment with a well-respected lawyer in town, a man known for his integrity, someone I thought would be horrified by what I'd found. I sat in his plush leather office, the smell of old books and lemon polish in the air, and laid out my evidence. He listened patiently, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with a pained, pitying expression. "Arthur," he said, calling me by my first name as if we were old friends, "this is compelling research. But it's not proof. It's insinuation. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? You're accusing a sitting circuit court judge of systemic corruption. Alistair Monroe? The man is an institution. He slid my dossier back across his polished mahogany desk. If you pursue this, his attorneys will bury you. They'll paint you as a vexatious litigant with a personal vendetta. They'll drain your savings and destroy your reputation. My advice, for your own good, is to let it go. Grieve for your daughter. Don't let this consume you. He was telling me the truth, of course. He was telling me how the world worked. But hearing it stated so plainly, so dismissively, only hardened my resolve. The system wasn't just broken, it was designed to protect men like Monroe. It had antibodies that attacked anyone who dared to question its integrity. My next attempt was to go to the press. I found an investigative reporter at the Post and Courier, a young, hungry guy who had written a few tough pieces on city council corruption. I sent him the dossier anonymously from a Proton Mail account I set up at the library. He was interested. For a week, my hopes soared. He called me from a burner phone, his voice hushed and excited. He was digging, verifying the land records. He said he was onto something huge. Then, silence. A week later, I saw a small article by him on the paper's website. It was about a zoning variance for a new restaurant on King Street. All the fire was gone. I called his burner. It was disconnected. I knew, with a sickening certainty, what had happened. Monroe had gotten to him. Or his editor. A phone call. A quiet threat about a libel suit. A reminder of who held the power in this town. And just like that, the story died. This was the true nature of Monroe's power. It wasn't just in his gavel, it was in the invisible web of influence he had woven throughout the city's legal, political, and social fabric. He was on the board of the university, the hospital, the symphony. His former clerks were now partners at major law firms. The lawyers who argued before him played golf with him on weekends. He had created a system of mutual benefit and protection. To go against him was to go against all of them. He was untouchable. My meager savings were dwindling. The initial fire of my righteous anger was being banked by a cold, creeping despair. I was a 72-year-old man, alone in a house that felt too big, fighting a ghost. Monroe, meanwhile, was thriving. I saw him once, getting out of his Mercedes in front of a restaurant downtown. He was laughing with a group of men, his face ruddy with health and privilege. He looked vital, powerful, invincible. He hadn't a care in the world, while my daughter was in the cold ground. The sight of him, so happy and untroubled, nearly broke me. I went home and sat in Clara's old workshop. Her tools were still there, neatly arranged. A half-finished piece of silk, the color of a summer sunset, was still draped over a drying rack. The air still held the faintest scent of her, of indigo and determination. I sat there for hours, surrounded by the silence of her absence, and felt the full weight of my own powerlessness. My investigation had been for nothing. The lawyer was right. I should just let it go. It was the second anniversary of her death. I drove out to St. Philip's Cemetery and stood before her grave, a simple granite stone engraved with her name and a single, elegant line, "She made the world more beautiful." The Charleston sun was warm on my back, but I felt a chill deep in my bones. I had failed her. I had let her killer thrive. I closed my eyes, and I thought about the subjects of my life's work. I had spent 40 years teaching history, studying the rise and fall of powerful men. I thought about the Roman emperors, the Renaissance princes, the Gilded Age robber barons. They all seemed invincible, until they weren't. And their downfall rarely came from a frontal assault, from an army meeting them on the field of battle. It came from within. From a trusted senator with a hidden knife. From a slow-acting poison. From a quiet, patient scheme that exploited their own arrogance and appetites. I had been trying to fight Monroe on his battlefield, the courts, the media. I had been trying to storm the castle walls. But I wasn't a soldier. I was a historian. An old man. And what if that wasn't a weakness? What if my age, my apparent harmlessness, was the perfect camouflage? A new thought began to form, not a hot flare of anger, but a cold, intricate lattice of logic. I couldn't expose his past crimes. The trail was too cold, the witnesses too intimidated. The system was designed to protect him. So I wouldn't try. I would give him a new crime to commit. I would build a trap, perfectly designed and tailored to his specific brand of corruption. I would bait it with something irresistible to a man like him. And I would be the one to spring it. He would never see it coming. Why would he? I was just a sad old man. A ghost. He had dismissed me, forgotten me. He wouldn't recognize me as a threat until it was far, far too late. I opened my eyes and looked at the name carved in the stone. Okay, Clara, I whispered to the quiet air. New plan. The grief was still there, a hollow ache in my chest. But for the first time in 2 years, it was joined by something else. A flicker of hope, not for justice in the abstract, but for something far more personal and absolute. I was no longer a victim seeking redress. I was a strategist planning a campaign. My age would be my disguise. My patience, my weapon. And his own greed would be the poison I would have him willingly drink. The despair that had clung to me like a shroud began to recede, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a man with nothing left to lose and one final, terrible thing to do. The first step in building a perfect trap is to understand the precise appetites of the creature you intend to catch. I knew Judge Monroe's weakness wasn't just money, it was a specific kind of easy, consequence-free money, laundered through his preferred channels and blessed by his co-conspirators. To catch him, I couldn't just present an opportunity for a bribe. I had to create a scenario so familiar, so perfectly aligned with his established method of corruption, that he would walk into it without a second thought. My plan had two main components, the bait and the inside source. The bait had to be a lawsuit. A carefully fabricated civil case, destined to land in his courtroom, involving a large sum of money and, crucially, one of the key players in his corrupt network. I spent a month liquidating the last of my valuable assets, selling the stock portfolio my wife had left me, taking out a reverse mortgage on my house. It was a terrifying gamble. If this failed, I would be left with nothing. I assembled a war chest of nearly $200,000. With a portion of this money, I hired a discreet corporate lawyer in Atlanta to set up 2 anonymous LLCs. The first, we'll call Finch Innovations, was the plaintiff. The second, Low Country Surveyors, was the defendant. I was the secret owner of both. The fictional dispute was a work of art. I used my academic background to invent a proprietary landscape scanning technology for Finch Innovations, complete with fake patents, technical manuals, and a backstory about its development for historical preservation surveys. Then, I had my Atlanta lawyer draw up documents showing that Low Country Surveyors, my other company, had infringed on this fake patent. It was a mirror image of Clara's case, but this time, I controlled all the pieces on the board. The final, critical piece of the puzzle was the legal representation. I needed my opponent, my own secret company, to be represented by Rutledge, Pinckney and Crane, the firm that served as Monroe's partners in crime. This was the trickiest part. I couldn't just walk in and hire them. So I created a persona, a brash, out-of-state investor who was the fictional manager of Low Country Surveyors. Through my Atlanta lawyer, this investor approached a junior partner at the firm, flashing a lot of money and acting just arrogant enough to seem like their kind of client. He laid out the frivolous lawsuit being brought against him by Finch Innovations and made it clear he wanted it to go away, quickly and quietly, and was willing to pay to make that happen. They took the case. The hook was set. I filed the lawsuit, and as I had prayed it would, the case was assigned to Judge Alistair Monroe. Now for the second component, the inside source. This was far more delicate. I couldn't hire an informant. I had to cultivate one. For weeks, I observed the ecosystem of the Charleston County Courthouse. I learned the rhythms, the faces, the places people went for coffee or lunch. I was looking for someone who was close to the judge but invisible to him. Someone young, overlooked, and likely disillusioned. I found her in the courthouse cafeteria. Her name was Elena. She was in her late 20s, a paralegal who worked directly for Judge Monroe's clerk. I saw her every day, sitting alone, eating a sad-looking salad from a plastic container, her face etched with a weary frustration that I recognized. She was drowning in the system, just like Clara had. I started frequenting a small cafe near the courthouse where she often stopped for coffee in the afternoons. I didn't approach her directly. I just became a fixture. The quiet old professor reading a history book in the corner. I'd nod politely. One day, I accidentally left a book on my table. It was a biography of Cicero, a figure I knew any student of the law would recognize. As I'd hoped, she picked it up and brought it to the counter. "I think you left this," she said. That was my opening. We talked about Roman law, about the ideals of justice versus the reality. I was careful. I never mentioned Monroe. I just listened. I learned she'd gone to law school at night, was buried in debt, and had taken the paralegal job with dreams of seeing justice in action, only to be crushed by the cynicism and cronyism she witnessed every day. Over several weeks, we built a fragile, tentative friendship over coffee. I was the grandfatherly figure she could vent to. She complained about her boss, the arrogance, the way cases were decided before they ever entered the courtroom. Finally, when I felt the moment was right, I shared a piece of my own story. I told her about Clara. Not the whole truth, not my plan for revenge, but the simple, heartbreaking story of a daughter whose faith in the law had been destroyed by a corrupt verdict. I didn't have to fake the tears in my eyes. She saw my pain, and in it, she saw a reflection of her own disillusionment. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered one afternoon, her voice barely audible. "The judge. He's the one who presided over your daughter's case." I just nodded. That was the moment she crossed the line. Her frustration curdled into a quiet fury. "He does it all the time," she said, her voice trembling. "Everyone knows, but nobody says anything. The lawyers, the clerks, they all just play along." I didn't ask her to do anything. I just sat there, letting the silence hang in the air. "What do you need?" she finally asked, her eyes hard with a newfound resolve. "I need to know how it works," I said. "When a case like my fake one comes up, how is the deal made? Who is the bagman?" Elena was my eyes and ears. From her position, she could see the unofficial traffic in and out of the judge's chambers. A week later, she had the answer. The go-between was a real estate developer named Marcus Thorne, a man whose name had appeared on some of the suspicious land deals I had researched. He was Monroe's designated fixer. When a friendly lawyer like the one from Rutledge, Pinckney and Crane wanted to guarantee a verdict, they didn't talk to the judge. They talked to Thorne. Thorne would then arrange the payment, always in the form of an inflated real estate purchase from one of Eleanor Monroe's trust accounts. Elena confirmed that the lawyer for my fake company had already met with Thorne. The bribe for my own case was in motion. The price to make my lawsuit go away was set at $200,000, to be paid for a dilapidated commercial property owned by the judge's wife's trust. The trap was now fully constructed. All the pieces were in place. All I had to do was spring it. This required the last, most dangerous part of my plan. I needed irrefutable proof of the transaction, something that couldn't be dismissed as a coincidence. I needed to record the exchange. To do that, I had to hire someone who operated in the shadows, someone who knew how to get that kind of proof without getting caught. I was about to move from the world of research into the world of surveillance. The risk was enormous. If I was discovered, I wouldn't just be ruined, I'd likely end up in prison. But the thought of Monroe's face when the trap finally snapped shut was more than enough to silence my fear. To capture the proof I needed, I had to find someone with a very specific and discrete set of skills. A historian's toolkit does not include long-lens photography and covert audio recording. Through a series of cautious inquiries, passed through my Atlanta lawyer to a trusted private investigator, I was put in touch with a man named Frank. He was a former federal agent, forced into early retirement over a disagreement with his superiors about procedural gray areas. In other words, he was a man who knew how to get things done, with or without a warrant. He was expensive, costing me a significant chunk of my remaining war chest, but one look at his cold, professional eyes told me he was worth every penny. We met in a nondescript diner off I-26. I laid out the entire plan. I showed him the research, the corporate structures, the names. I told him about Monroe, the lawyer, and Marcus Thorne, the developer acting as the bagman. I told him the price for my verdict was $200,000 and that it would be laundered through the purchase of a specific property. Frank listened without interruption, his face impassive. When I was finished, he simply stirred his coffee and said, "So you want me to get evidence of a quid pro quo between a lawyer and a developer that will directly implicate a sitting judge? That's not just risky, Mr. Finch. That's a unicorn hunt." "I have the unicorn's location and feeding schedule," I replied. "I just need you to take the picture." A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Okay, Professor," he said. "Let's go hunting." Elena was my lifeline. She was the one who, through hushed, brief phone calls from a payphone, gave us the critical intelligence. She confirmed the meeting point, a private room at the Palmetto Club, an old money establishment where Charleston's elite made their deals over whiskey and cigars. She gave us the date and time. The lawyer from Rutledge, Pinckney and Crane would be meeting Marcus Thorne to finalize the land deal. This was the moment the bribe would be officially arranged. Frank was a master of his craft. The day before the meeting, he and his two-man team swept the room. Posing as technicians from a high-end audiovisual company upgrading the club's security, they installed 2 microscopic cameras and a directional microphone, all seamlessly hidden within the room's mahogany paneling and ornate light fixtures. The devices were state-of-the-art, broadcasting a secure, encrypted signal to a van Frank would have parked a block away. The day of the meeting, I sat in that van with Frank, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the bank of monitors in front of us. I felt like a character in a spy movie, a life so far removed from my quiet, academic existence that it felt surreal. Then, they appeared on the screen. First, Marcus Thorne, the developer, a thick-set man with an oily smile. Then, the lawyer, looking crisp and confident in his $1,000 suit. They shook hands. They ordered drinks. The audio crackled to life. For the first 20 minutes, they engaged in meaningless small talk, golf, politics, the weather. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. What if they didn't discuss the case? What if it was all done with a nod and a wink? Frank seemed unconcerned, his eyes glued to the monitors. "Patience, Professor," he murmured. "The dance always starts slow." And then, it happened. The lawyer leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "So, about the lowcountry surveyor's matter," he began. "My client is getting anxious. He wants assurance that his complications will be resolved favorably." Thorne took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Assurances have a price. We discussed it. The property on the Naval Shipyard grounds. 200. That's a steep price for a condemned warehouse," the lawyer countered, a hint of theatrical haggling in his voice. Thorne chuckled. It was a low, unpleasant sound. "You're not buying a warehouse. You're buying peace of mind. You're buying a verdict. The judge has already seen the preliminary filings. He's prepared to rule your opponent's patent claim as baseless. But his wife's historical preservation fund is in dire need of a charitable donation. This is that donation. Is your client in or out?" I held my breath. It was more explicit, more brazen than I could have ever hoped for. They were spelling it out. "He's in," the lawyer said, sliding a folder across the table. "Here's the signed purchase agreement. The funds will be transferred to the trust's account by morning." I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Frank glanced at me, and for the first time, I saw a look of genuine respect in his eyes. He tapped a button on his console. "We've got it," he said, his voice flat and professional. "Crystal clear audio and video. Quid pro quo established. The unicorn is in the bag." The money from my shell company was transferred the next morning. A day later, Elena confirmed that Judge Monroe had received a memo from Thorne. The fix was in. All that was left was the final act in the theater of the courtroom. I had to let him rule against me. A week later, I found myself in his courtroom. Not as a spectator this time, but as the plaintiff. I sat at the table next to my Atlanta lawyer, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Monroe was on the bench, looking down at me with that same air of bored superiority he had shown my daughter. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just another case file, another name on a docket. He listened to the arguments, a picture of judicial solemnity. Then he delivered his ruling. He read from a prepared statement, his voice resonating with false authority. He called my fake company's claims frivolous and without merit. He tore apart my meticulously fabricated evidence. He ruled decisively in favor of Lowcountry Surveyors, the company I owned, represented by the lawyer who had bribed him with my own money. He even had the gall to moralize, speaking about the sanctity of intellectual property and the danger of vexatious litigation. It was a carbon copy of the speech he had given when he destroyed Clara. I sat there and took it, my face a mask of disappointment. Inside, a cold, triumphant fire was blazing. He had just convicted himself. As he struck his gavel down, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom, he had no idea he wasn't ending a case. He was ending his entire world. The trap had been sprung. The door had slammed shut. And he was the only one inside who couldn't hear it. The day after the verdict, I didn't file an appeal. I didn't protest or complain. I let the silence settle, allowing Monroe and his conspirators to believe they had won another easy victory. I wanted them to feel secure, to relax back into their comfortable arrogance. Patience, as a historian knows, is the most powerful corrosive agent. While they celebrated, Frank and I were preparing the final presentation. He took the raw surveillance files and edited them into a damning, undeniable narrative. It was a multimedia dossier, a high-definition video of the meeting at the Palmetto Club, crystal clear audio of the bribe being discussed, and a clean, easy-to-follow paper trail showing my money flowing from my shell company, through the lawyer's firm, into the developer's hands, and finally landing as an overpayment for a worthless property owned by the judge's wife's trust. To this, I added a sworn affidavit from Elena, who had bravely agreed to testify. She detailed the inner workings of Monroe's chambers, corroborating the pattern of corruption with specific dates and case numbers. Her testimony was the human element, the voice from inside the fortress that confirmed the sickness within. Armed with this package, we bypassed Charleston completely. The rot there went too deep. We drove 2 hours northwest, to the state capital, Columbia. We walked into the FBI field office, a sterile, anonymous building of glass and steel. We didn't ask for a junior agent or a desk sergeant. We asked for the special agent in charge. My age and Frank's former credentials got us through the door. We sat in a small, windowless interview room across from a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s. She looked at me, a 72-year-old man in a slightly frayed tweed jacket, and at Frank, a gruff ex-agent, with a weary skepticism. She'd probably seen 1,000 conspiracy theories and half-baked accusations. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. I didn't give a long, emotional speech. I didn't talk about Clara. I simply placed a heavy binder on the metal table between us. "In this file," I said, my voice steady, "you will find video and audio evidence of a conspiracy to commit bribery and honest services fraud, implicating South Carolina Circuit Court Judge Alistair Monroe, Attorney David Crane of Rutledge, Pinckney and Crane, and real estate developer Marcus Thorne." I pushed the binder toward her. "The evidence is self-explanatory." She opened it. She started with the transcript of the audio recording. I watched her eyes skim the first page, then the second. The professional mask of skepticism began to crumble, replaced by an intense, focused concentration. She put on a pair of headphones Frank provided and watched the video, her expression hardening into a cold, angry mask. She saw the handshake, heard the casual discussion of selling a verdict for $200,000. She saw the entire crime, from negotiation to execution. When she was done, she took off the headphones and looked at me, her gaze entirely changed. The weariness was gone, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a hunter who has just spotted her prey. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice low and serious. "I need you to tell me everything. From the very beginning." The federal investigation was swift and silent. For 2 weeks, the world continued as normal. Monroe continued to preside over his courtroom. The lawyers continued to play their games. But beneath the surface, the FBI was moving, gathering its forces, securing warrants. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the hammer fell. It was coordinated and absolute. At 10 a.m., FBI agents walked into the Charleston County Courthouse. They didn't knock. They entered Judge Monroe's courtroom in the middle of a hearing, walked up to the bench, and arrested him in front of a stunned audience of lawyers, defendants, and jurors. They led him out in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and utter disbelief. At the same moment, another team raided the offices of Rutledge, Pinckney, and Crane, seizing computers and boxes of files. David Crane was arrested at his desk. Marcus Thorne was pulled from a board meeting downtown. It was a decapitation strike, executed with brutal federal efficiency. The story exploded. The front page of the Post and Courier was a thing of beauty. A massive, full-color photo of Judge Monroe, the great lion of the Charleston bar, being put into the back of an unmarked federal car, his legacy and reputation evaporating in the flash of a news camera. The headline screamed, "Prominent Judge Arrested in FBI Bribery Sting." The city was in an uproar. The invincible man had been toppled. The untouchable fortress had been breached. The fallout was a cascade of destruction. Faced with our airtight evidence, both the lawyer and the developer confessed and agreed to testify against Monroe in exchange for lighter sentences. Their testimony blew the conspiracy wide open. They gave up names, dates, and other cases. The initial investigation into my one fake lawsuit spawned a massive public corruption probe that ensnared a dozen of Charleston's most powerful figures, including Harrison Croft, the man who had stolen my daughter's patent. His dealings with Monroe were uncovered, and he was indicted for his role in the bribery scheme. Monroe was utterly destroyed. His name became a synonym for corruption. His friends abandoned him. His wife filed for divorce and fled the state. He was disbarred, his portrait was taken down from the courthouse wall, and his name was scrubbed from the charity boards he once lorded over. At his trial, I sat in the back of the federal courtroom and watched. He looked like a different person, shrunken, gray, all the arrogant confidence bled out of him. He was just a pathetic old man, exposed as a common thief in a black robe. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He had traded his honor for parcels of swampland, and now he would spend his twilight years in a concrete cell. My revenge was complete. It was surgical. It was absolute. And it brought me no joy. Only a profound, quiet, and empty sense of finality. The war was over. I had won. But my victory felt as silent and as lonely as the house I would be returning to. I drove back to Charleston that evening. The news was still buzzing on the radio, analysts and commentators dissecting the fall of the city's most powerful judge. To them, it was a story about crime and punishment, about a flaw in the system being corrected. They didn't know the real story. They didn't know it was all a memorial, a quiet, intricate monument of vengeance built for a girl who loved the color of goldenrod and believed in rules that didn't exist. The next morning, I visited Clara's grave. The sun was filtering through the ancient live oaks, casting dappled light on the grass. It was peaceful. I brought a copy of the newspaper with me, the one with Monroe's face on the front, humiliated and broken. I folded it neatly and placed it at the base of her headstone, a final report on a promise kept. I had done it. I had corrected the scales, not with a blind faith in justice, but with the cold, patient application of history's harshest lessons. Standing there in the quiet cemetery, with the ghosts of the past all around me, I finally felt the heavy weight I had been carrying for 2 years begin to dissolve, not into happiness, but into a quiet, solemn peace. The end.